Good morning, everyone. It is currently the morning after the Boston Marathon here in Boston, Massachusetts at 5:56 in the morning. Pretty awesome city though, really awesome community, and it brings us to a beautiful springtime morning, which is what I want to talk about today, more or less. So we are seated in the lovely Boston Commons, and with that I want to talk about I guess something that a lot of people have been feeling for the past few years, but it's really only started to affect me in the last year, I suppose. So I guess like most people, I have a really hard time focusing. So what that means for me is that my brain is pretty much running at 5,000, 7,000 RPM, but it's not really going anywhere. A lot of the time I need something to distract me, whether I'm doing dishes or running. I'm still able to do, but it feels like you're kind of in this constant state of not improving, not really disimproving, which apparently in psychology there's a word for that, and that word is languishing. So if mental health were a spectrum, on one end you'd have flourishing, which is that you're doing extremely well, you find meaning and purpose and community in life. The other end is depression, which is of course the opposite, that you feel alone, purposeless, hopeless. Something in the middle, which I guess a lot of people have experienced in the past few years for a good reason, is languishing. I guess these ducks are famous or something, I don't really know why though. But with all that said, what am I getting into? And that's why the topic of today's video is springtime. And that might be a new record for me being out in the field actually talking about what I wanted to talk about. So that's progress. And between having to talk about photography and psychology and a bunch of other things on my mind at that point, we're back in Pennsylvania, so now I can kind of really elaborate what I wanted to talk about, which is called languishing. For about a year since I started my most recent job, which I started a little over a year ago, I noticed that I've started to watch every single YouTube video at either almost never normal speed, either at 125% speed or 150% speed, sometimes 175% speed. And I have a very funny story to share, which is that sometime I was talking to one of my coworkers during the day, and in a bragging manner, I told them that. I said, I like YouTube videos are too slow to me. This is weird. We're both videographers. We make videos all day, but it was weird. And so I told her, I was like, I absorb information way faster than the average person because I watch YouTube videos at 150% speed. And her reaction was definitely not impressed. It was kind of something along the line. She paused for a moment and she went, oh, so you have like a pretty short attention span. Something like that. And my reaction was something like this. And it did make me realize that, yes, my attention span is really short. I can't do chores or laundry or pretty much any average task without listening to music, listening to a podcast, having something else to engage me. I do also run fairly often, so running, I needed also a podcast or music, and I've really tried to embrace not doing that, to appreciate the world around me. My brain almost needs to be at its limit of engaging and interacting and receiving a dopamine, pretty much dopamine I assume, before it can actually function. I can never sit back and appreciate and look around the world around me because that is simply too slow in a world like this. And the worst activity of all was reading. I was never a huge reader in life, but I tried to do, read a few books a year because it is a nice way to wind down the afternoon, so I'd read a few pages, but more and more I'd read at least a page, 2 pages, and then totally shut off, go back to my phone until it ended up being 12:45 a.m. But my favorite app, my on and off favorite app, has become Pocket. And the best way to put it is you can think of Pocket like a treasury for the most interesting content on the internet. You can think of it kind of like Twitter, but it's actually useful. And it's a steady stream of either bite-sized articles, 5-minute reads, 10-minute reads. It actually tells you how long it takes to read an article, which on average is probably about 8 minutes, but sometimes you'll see a 32-minute, 35-minute read, either about an interesting person, an interesting topic, an interesting moment in history. Really great stuff, and I've been addicted to that because you can actually read those bite-sized segments rather than trying to look at a book. You're 100 out of 600 pages in. It doesn't look achievable. A lot of the time, sometimes there's a progress bar on the top of an article, which feels, again, in today's modern world, it feels like you're doing something productive. Kind of tricks your brain. And among this flood of articles about psychology, how to fix your brain and how to fix your habits, I came across one very interesting one that came about 2 years ago to the day that I read it. I'll say the beginning of April, but about 2 years ago, which surprisingly was 2021. And in it, it describes a feeling and a headspace that I think certainly many people at the time felt, but I only realized after a year of this, pretty much, of just kind of rolling. And yes, that word, as the article, which I'll link down below, called it, and as what a new movement, I guess a new movement in psychology called positive psychology, positive psychology called it, is this term called languishing. And in languishing, you're not mentally ill, you're not mentally sick, but you're certainly not mentally healthy. Pocket discovered languishing. Oh yeah, this is a photography channel to some extent, I promise. So to tie it all together, one of the books that I actually was successfully reading was, of course, Atomic Habits by James Clear. Extremely, extremely popular book in the last few years, and I think for a very good reason. What that book basically says, and the title of it implies, Atomic Habits, of course, very, very small incremental changes, but atoms do make up the very foundation of life itself. If you didn't know that, now you do know. But basically what that means is, yes, very incremental small changes that you do not notice hour to hour, minute to minute, second to second, day to day, week to week, moving the other way. But over time, if you look at January 1st, 2022 to January 1st, 2023, if those incremental changes are implemented, you see something very different. To now tie this all together back to where we left Boston, Corey, off, we're talking about springtime, which I think is a very obvious connection. March 1st, you don't notice any changes. The weather starts to get a little bit warmer. Rain isn't as cold as it used to be. By March 5th, this feels like the same thing. March 10th, March 15th, March 20th, we're still moving along. It's still probably, and things aren't changing that much. I should have done April. Assume that was April. And the same thing goes. The 17th isn't different to the 19th. The 27th isn't similar to the 30th, which it's the 28th. But all of a sudden you look back and the 28th is very different from April 1st, which is pretty spectacular. And I think that's why springtime is changing to my second favorite season. I still think fall is probably the best, but fall's pretty cool. Taking a look at the world around you and having a sense of gratitude, a sense of belonging, a sense of change, that change is possible even though it doesn't look like it day to day. But again, if you look at where you came from to where you are now, change is very possible. And I think springtime is a beautiful reflection of that. I hope you do find flourishing in your life, but in the meantime, I think a lot of people still experience this idea of languishing, which is that change seems possible, but sort of out of reach, and you don't have a direction to move. But when you do, you shouldn't expect things to be so obvious, because springtime is obvious, but it also is very slow, and it's good to appreciate that. Back to Boston? I forgot to tie it back to landscape photography. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a little bit obvious of photography is exactly what photography is noticing the world around you. Photography, by definition from its Latin or Greek roots, is shaping with light. You make a photograph, it is art, and I think there's an eye for it. It's certainly faster than painting, but in the same way, I think you create beauty out of photography, and you have to find it, which, to me, that's what springtime is all about for me now. All right, I think we can go back to Boston. So as the spring season approached a few weeks ago, I've severely misjudged A, how long my legs are to get me places, and B, how long it takes for the sun to rise. But that's one of the main changes that I'd like to see my own springtime in my life, is a little more patience, and a little more calming down of the brain. And this is not a particularly bad place to try and do that. If you couldn't tell, we are in the historic district of Beacon Hill in Boston, Massachusetts. So unfortunately, still a little crowded by cars, but very lovely, tiny, packed streets. Very European, very cool. But you can always count on a good steeple to give you that first morning light. There we go, we're finally getting a little bit of light here. Patience. And another thing about the Boston Marathon is that my girlfriend completed it yesterday. She had the opportunity to do it without needing to qualify, and as a first marathon, it was super awesome, and she finished, which is the greatest thing ever. So good job, Gabby, and good job to all the runners. It was a great weekend.